Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, today marks 20 days to this year's G20 summit in the eastern Chinese city of Hangzhou. So where's China's role in paving the way for global economic growth will be at the top of the agenda. So what can the world expect to see? And hundreds of South Koreans shaved their heads in a public protest against the new THAAD missile system, even as their president defends her decision at the country's Liberation Day celebrations. Should Seoul change its mind? We begin today's show with the upcoming G20 summit in the Chinese city of Hangzhou to be held on September the 4th. Chinese President Xi Jinping will give a keynote speech at the opening ceremony and chair the summit. Non-G20 member countries, including Laos, Chad, Kazakhstan, Senegal, and Egypt, will also take part in the event. As the world's second largest economy, what kind of solution can China bring to the table this year? Let's take a look at this.
20 days to go. Themed to move towards an innovative, revitalized, interconnected, and inclusive world economy, the G20 summit this year is expected to draw global attention as the global economy continues to weaken. Ahead of the summit, China announced its top 3 targets.
The
first target is to give play to the guiding role of G20, indicating direction and seeking driving force for the global economy. The second is to enhance international economic cooperation, sending a strong political signal featuring unity, cooperation, openness, and inclusiveness. The third is to make innovation in mechanism construction and to build a cooperation platform.
The summit is expected to have 10 major outcomes, which will include a blueprint for global growth, economic reforms, and trade and investment. Leaders will come up with strategies in fighting climate change and corruption. This year's G20 summit will be the first at which foreign exchange markets will be discussed in detail as leaders work toward advancing financial reforms worldwide.
We need to instill market confidence and ensure there are no competitive devaluations, but rather let the market determine exchange rates.
Since the 2008 financial crisis, some G20 member states have proposed coming up with an economic stimulus plan, while others remain undecided. But G20 countries have reached multiple agreements this year towards building a new world economic order. In July, trade ministers agreed to cut global trade costs by 15% by the end of the year. Finance ministers have also agreed to new economic reform measures, and member countries will now face an evaluation of their reforms every 2 years. The world economy is still facing a hard time, with increasing terrorist attacks, Brexit complications, and US election uncertainties. In the face of such a difficult year, hopes run high that the upcoming G20 can pave the way forward.
For more on the G20 global governance and Chinese wisdom, as they say, we are joined here in Beijing by Mr. Zhang Jianping, who is the director of International Economic Cooperation Institute at the National Development and Reform Commission. Welcome to our program. Meanwhile, joining us from London, we have Mr. Ian Begg, Professorial Research Fellow at the European Institute in the London School of Economics. Meanwhile, joining us from Washington, D.C. in the U.S., we are having Mr. Scott Kennedy, Director of the Project on Chinese Business and Politics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. First of all, can we expect discussions and debates mainly on economic and financial policies rather than geopolitical ones? Mr. Zhang?
Yeah, I think that actually geopolitical issues will impact, on both economic cooperation and financial cooperation, global governance issues. Meanwhile, on the regional cooperation level, also have this type of effect. Especially today, actually, that globalization and the regional economic integration, both of them are promoting However, those political issues and especially some of headache problems happened, and then I'm afraid that those issues will impact on our trade issues, investment issues.
That's right. You can hardly separate one from all the others. But that seems to be the hope of the organizer, at least according to the press conference given today by the Chinese host side. Mr. Kennedy, what do you make of it, particularly given the political elections going on in your country and its impact possibly on your country's future economic and financial policies?
Well, there's certainly a full plate of economic issues for the G20 to discuss, and I expect that will take up almost all of the time for the G20 meeting itself, unless something emerges before then, although the different parties, when they make their statements, can talk about a whole variety of issues, as they do at the G7. Probably non-economic issues, if they come up with any extent, will occur in the bilateral meetings between President Xi and the other leaders, and I'm sure will do so when President Obama speaks to Xi Jinping privately.
Mr. Begg, of course, many are pointing to the UK, suggesting the Brexit is likely to be the focus of all the challenges that we might be facing for the years to come for the G20 summit leaders. Do you agree? How much politics, how much economic and financial issues?
Well, I think the general answer is that you can never underestimate the possibility of something unexpected occurring, be it a terrorist attack or an upsurge in a refugee crisis. Any of these sorts of things can happen. This time, though, I'd expect Brexit to be relatively low on the agenda because it's in a kind of cold storage at the moment. There's been the vote 2 months ago, but the next stage is going to be when Britain formally applies to leave the European Union, and that looks now like being delayed. So all that will weigh on the global economy at the moment is the uncertainty around Brexit, rather than any of the negotiations and the ramifications of these negotiations. That said, I think it's pretty clear that there's a very wide economic agenda that has to be confronted, which is really about managing globalization.
Right. G20, of course, is one of the world's most important platforms, as we discussed earlier. Accounts for 90% of the G20 economies of the overall global trade and 80% of overall global economy. However, the G20, as many believe, should not be and is not a rich countries club. Its mission is to coordinate state policies, influence global economic trends, and achieve win-win situation for all countries. That seemed to be also reflected, Mr. Zhang, I have to say, in the overall agenda of the G20 this time. You not only got the B20, which is the business world of the 20 economies, you also got the G20 summit, and on the sideline you have several developing countries that are not on the G20's platform, in fact coming together as observer countries. And you also got the BRICS meetings on the sideline of the G20s as well. So how much will addressing the developing economies issues, emerging economies come up with their core ideas, be able to help us find solutions of today?
If you look back, you may find that in 1999, when G20 had the first meeting and first forum, at that time actually after Asia financial crisis, and the G8 felt that without dialogue with those developing economies, you will find it's very difficult to deal with financial crisis.
But may I remind you, Mr. Zhang, also over the past few years, emerging economies, some of them have not been doing very well. Instead of being the engine, some suggest they're being the problems of some of the developing world. What do you say?
If you look at according to PPP calculation, you may find that the economic scale from developing economies already close to the developed world, according to OECD calculation. So that means today, if you look at the global economy, both developing economies and developed economies are playing very important role. That's why G20, on behalf of most of economy scale in the world, their dialogue, policy dialogue, and their, action together, also their planning, ambitious planning for the future, and some of policy tools can promote, global economic recovery. Meanwhile, we hope we can resolve, economic restructuring issues in the world.
Mr. Begg, though, we are looking at a very different time compared to when the G20 was born. At that time, the developed economies wants developing ones and emerging ones to play a bigger role and bigger responsibility of the world economy, because the former seem to suffer a great deal, and their shall I say, remedies to the economy have not worked, it seems, according to the crisis. And yet now, we are seeing trade disputes between the developed world, developing ones, emerging ones. The former is saying, let's tighten it up. Others are saying, well, shall we just open it as what it was like when you guys were developing your economies? That's where the core issue is. That also means, are we going to have any consensus being reached at the G20 meetings and summit this time? Because we are talking about very different groups with very different agendas. Mr. Beck.
Yes, and I think also you have to consider that even within groups there are major differences.
That's right.
You mentioned earlier on the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and maybe South Africa. Now, there you've got three countries, South Africa, Brazil and Russia, which are in economic difficulty, significant economic difficulty, very much commodity-based economies, whereas China, as you know, is a strong manufacturing economy. Now, their common ground is not as great as we might think, because they have this label, which comes out of Goldman Sachs, in fact, and it's not a very consistent label about describing their characteristics. So what we'll be looking for in this is ways of managing the many imbalances in the world economy. And here I think we in Europe have to recognize that Europeans are now a source of imbalance because of the significant trade surplus that's been emerging over the last 2 or 3 years. There's also the problem that financial instability has not gone away in many parts of the world and may well return. So what we're looking for is pathways through this, and the G20, because it only meets very infrequently, can only give a steer to what happens elsewhere.
Right.
It has to steer the leadership elsewhere and give ways of trying to make progress. But it is not a big executive body, and that's something we maybe misunderstand about it.
Mr. Kennedy, despite it's not necessarily a big platform for policies, people are pinning hope on it because we're at a difficult time. Any kind of platform, we want to make good use of it. And yet the question is, can we, given the complexities both gentlemen earlier have already talked about? Mr. Kennedy.
Sure. Well, I think we will see incremental progress at the G20 on a wide range of issues, from trade to investment to generating growth, financial governance. These have all been discussed over the past several months, and I expect all will be on the agenda in Hangzhou. We'll see incremental progress in each of these things. What has been said by the other guests, the G20 is not an executive body. It doesn't make final decisions by itself. What it does is reach some type of agreement or consensus, which is then implemented in other institutions like the WTO or IMF or the Financial Security Board, or that for the individual members themselves to take on by them and individually. And I think actually that's where much of the progress in terms of generating growth needs to occur. For example, China's slowing growth is really to get it going further, you need supply side reform to achieve a lot more progress, and that would help a lot. So some things can be discussed at the G20, but a lot is going to be decided elsewhere.
Yes, indeed. But just to follow up, Mr. Kennedy, yes, indeed, some of those will be incorporated into whatever, maybe a final communique among all the state leaders and also business leaders. And yet, all the details related to those big statements are really going to matter the most, even as the iron and steel industry could be, which is a sunset industry, by the way, could be such a big deal between, let's just say, China, India, and the developed world. That is only one drop of water in the big sea that could stir up the debates between and among different camps. So, Mr. Kennedy, once again, how much can be done, and how much do you expect from the final communique or final discussions?
Again, the G20's goal isn't to reach final solution on any of these one problems. It's to identify them, to frame them. And I think actually what's interesting is that there's a lot of consensus on what the problems are, what issues need to be tackled, despite the fact that you've got such a diverse group of countries. But they also recognize the G20 isn't the place to negotiate the final agreements on what everyone is going to do. So I expect to see some good momentum from the G20 meeting, but it's not going to be a place that's not the purpose of the G20. It's not the permanent five of the UN Security Council for economic issues. It has a different role.
Yes, indeed. Mr. Zhang, but from China's perspective, as the host of the G20 this time, it hopes to achieve as much as possible as long as there is consensus among members of the G20 and all the participatory bodies. What do you think, despite the fact that earlier the B20 and the finance minister central bank governors meeting have been doing quite well?
Actually, I think that both for financial governors, banks governance meetings and trade ministers meetings and financial ministers meetings, you may find that this time actually practically China promoted G20 as fast as they can do. For example, if you look at trade minister meetings in the past, you cannot make sure which year there will be the trade ministers meeting. But this year we can confirm in the future annually we will have trade ministers meetings. This is a very big progress. Meanwhile,
as long as they meet, there could be something happen, right?
Right. Secondly, if you look at the investment field, you may find that this time China play a constructive role. We suggest to have our 9 principles for international investment. So this is a first step. In the future, maybe we can design global investment framework on which you may find that both developing economies and developing economies can benefit from that. Third one, I think that on monetary policies, especially you mentioned, in order to prevent competitive depreciation, that means we have to dialogue on foreign exchange rate issues. That's also very critical.
And of course, that's this job, the IMF and some of the other organizations, yet the issues at least can be discussed at the G20 summit. Having said that, though, there are some other issues. We've seen competitive ideas and platforms being proposed over the years, even just about trade itself, even just about the grand plan of the future. We talk a lot of TPP, OBOR, One Belt, One Road initiatives for that, and some of the regional mechanism as well. We do not know when the dust will settle. Are we going to see once again those debates being picked up at the G20, whether it's B20 or the G20 summit, or on the sideline of it? Will this platform provide a better understanding for all parties, or only getting those fights ever more fearful? Mr. Kennedy.
I'm sure that those will be discussed. I think that we ought to see that since the Doha round collapsed in 2008, or at least came to a standstill, the development of regional agreements, plurilateral agreements has expanded. Leading countries throughout the world, including China, have promoted these. And I think even though it might be ideal to have everything in terms of trade be adopted by the WTO in Geneva, with that at a standstill, many paths to liberalization, even competitive liberalization, is the road that we're on right now. And hopefully eventually paths will lead back to Geneva, perhaps through an FTAP. But I don't think, the WTO has rules about what regional and plurilateral agreements should look like, and as long as they're consistent, they're accepted. We have over almost 400 of them right now. So I expect that trend is going to continue. And I don't, we can make the best of it. It's not the perfect world, but it's something that we can live with.
All right. And Mr. Beck, I do have another question for you as well, because Europe and Russia has not necessarily been on great terms, and yet Russia, as we can see, has been topping the guest list this time. Even your prime minister has confirmed, according to some media reports, to have a bilateral with the Russian President Vladimir Putin this time during the G20 summit. So what can we expect out of this, even on the sidelines? Some rare opportunities?
Yeah, I think that there's always opportunities for leaders to get together in a quiet room to discuss the things that have been causing so much difficulty. Now, Russia is a very difficult case at the moment because it's economically weak but militarily belligerent at the moment, as we've seen in Ukraine. And what I would expect is that the G20 provides a forum in which leaders can meet in a non-confrontational way to try to make the beginnings of new approaches. And we will see this as well in the economics, because it's an opportunity to set strategic directions, to make political commitments which are then followed through in long-term developments, such as in the infrastructure, in the One Belt, One Road approach.
Right.
That's where G20 has its unique role in trying to create momentum for change.
All right. And finally, for you, Mr. Zhang, a country like China, host of the G20, yet a lot of issues going on.
Yeah.
Because we have seen China was playing the host of the APEC 2 years ago, which was believed as a great success. And now G20 seems to be a big deal for the Chinese as well, if you know what is going on in Hangzhou right now. And secondly, you've also seen China's economic slowdown. That is just a fact, even though China is doing the reform, as they say. Meanwhile, you also see U.S.-China relations and China's neighboring relations in the Asia-Pacific region have been going through some ups and downs. And China is experiencing next year some very important Chinese Communist Party meetings for the next generation of leaders. All of this are happening right after and right before the G20 summit. China is the host. What can China achieve this time?
Yeah, this is a quite
It's a huge question,
yes.
and you got only 1 minute left,
Yeah.
Mr. Zhang.
I think that now this is a critical time point for China. So first time for China to host G20. There is a very big significance for both China and the world. I think that China will grasp these very valuable opportunities. We can provide our, Oriental wisdom and Chinese solutions to, G20. We hope G20 could be more practical and could be, that some of people just argue that G20 will be just a, policy discussion. There is no, practice. But I will say that after this time, G20 will become more practical. We will have more and more ambitious goals. Meanwhile, we can take a series of actions. Of course, for China, we will create our more open economic system. We will have our series of reform and opening up. That means by this the new round of reform and opening up, we can seek our opportunities in regional market and the global market. So that means China's economy will become more sustainable, and those countries in different regions and in the world also will get opportunities from China, because China's investors, because China's manufacturers move into other countries, something like that.
All right.
Yeah.
We are talking about inclusive growth.
Yeah.
We hope that is not just a slogan, but rather things that really likely to be implemented by all economies of the G20. Thank you so much, Zhang Zhenping, Ian Begg, and Scott Kennedy. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us and shedding some light on the future agenda of G20 this time in China. Thank you so much. And stay with us here on World Insight. We've got our final segment coming right up. Hundreds shaved their heads in a loud protest against South Korea's planned deployment of the THAAD missile system, a move that has triggered division across the country, as some say, and region as well. Should Seoul reconsider, some say? Welcome back. And now let's turn to South Korea, where protests against the deployment of the THAAD missile system has continued ever since Seoul made its controversial decision last month. Residents in Seongju, where the system will be deployed, have shaved their heads in protest on August 15th, the country's National Liberation Day. President Park of South Korea is facing objections from several opposition parties domestically, as well as neighboring countries. Recent polls show that she is falling in popularity among South Koreans. Could President Park change her decision? Can the Korean Peninsula issue be fixed? Before we go on our discussion, let's take a look at this background.
Deep division. The anti-THAAD protests continue in South Korea's Seongju County, where the missile defense system is expected to be deployed. On August 15th, South Korea's Liberation Day, more than 800 residents shaved their heads in a public protest. Voices against the deployment of the THAAD system have surged in Seongju, and there are deep rifts between political parties in South Korea.
For important issues like deployment of that system, the government has not actively persuaded neighboring countries and South Korean citizens. That's why I think there are problems with the procedure and process in making the decision.
6 anti-THAAD lawmakers of the Minju Party, the main opposition party, even came to China last week to share their views on the issue, prompting criticism from President Park.
I think as politicians who have authority delegated from the whole nation, they should cooperate across political lines and not strengthen internal split regarding the issues related with national security.
The South Korean government insists that the deployment of THAAD is aimed at protecting their people from the DPRK nuclear threat. In recent months, the DPRK has kept up with its missile tests. Earlier this month, a test-fired ballistic missile landed in Japanese waters. Meanwhile, Japan, a US ally, says it plans to start discussions on a THAAD deployment in Japan. The DPRK has slammed South Korea for its THAAD deployment. Beijing and Moscow have also opposed Seoul's decision. The THAAD issue has dragged President Park's party into major domestic political disputes, but on top of that, it could just have complicated the Korean Peninsula even more.
For more on the THAAD and also the overall situation on the Korean Peninsula, we are joined in our Beijing studio Yang Xiyu, Senior Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. In Seoul, we are having Yoongjung Lim, Lecturer of Korea Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Welcome to both of you. First of all, Ms. Lim, you are now in Seoul. You probably have a better idea than most of us as to what exactly is the sentiment inside South Korea regarding the THAAD system, which we believe in this part of the world as very divisive for the politics in South Korea, and also certainly create some problems between South Korea and China, for example, South Korea and Russia also.
Yes, first and foremost, I have to emphasize the fact that the South Korea is a liberal democracy, which means every different voices, opinions, different views can coexist together. So you might wonder, if you see, for example, public poll results, it looks like a majority of South Korean citizens still do understand the rationale of the THAAD deployment or the reasons why we need it, within the territory. But at the same time, you do see that kind of political turmoil, especially in the local community in Seongju County. I would say it is rather than a kind of huge opposition against the THAAD itself. It was much more about the kind of criticism or skepticism about the decision-making process. Because especially from the Seongju County's people's point of view, the decision was pretty abrupt and pretty unilaterally announced without a kind of pre-consultation with the local community. So I would say, I mean, the anger is much more about the procedure rather than, for example, the alliance, ROK-US alliance, or the THAAD itself.
It seems that you are giving quite an objective view about exactly what's going on. That seems to be also the various media reports suggest, both from South Korea and from different parts of the world. Mr. Yang, having heard that, China, of course, has a big issue with South Korea about the THAAD system. China does not want it to be deployed in South Korea, with the danger that it could, in a way, have a breach to China's future security, particularly a threat coming from the United States. What can China do at this moment?
Well, at this moment, almost nothing to do substantively. We hope the THAAD deployment can be brought about, but it's impossible. But I think the consequences of the upcoming deployment will produce profound effects and influences, not only in this region, but also on South Korea. South Korea focuses on tactical and tactical and political issue on missile threats from the North Korea.
Right.
China look at the issue as a strategic stability, because U.S. want to make THAAD in South Korea as one of the pillars for the regional missile anti-missile systems that will break the global strategic stabilities among the powers.
Well, Mr. Yang, may I just ask you, by being more specific, because what we are having on the media reports, at least according to the American media, the U.S. Missile Defense Chief visited Seoul recently, and he was suggesting what we are having, suggesting, you know, South Korea and the United States. He said what we are having has nothing to do with global missile defense system, and the U.S. is not to include South Korea into that specific system. That's at least according to the American side. What do you make of it?
Well, I don't trust that.
Why not?
Okay. U.S. on behalf of anti-Iranian missile threats, U.S. has set up an anti-missile system in Europe. And now U.S. plan to make use of North Korean missile threats to build up a anti-missile system in East Asia. That's the same for both of the global strategy. The NMD, National Missile Defense, is in nature global missile defense.
Okay.
So that is set strategy of the United States. So what we have seen that U.S. has deployed, for example, 3 X-band radar in this region, 2 of them in Japan, and going to be 1 in South Korea.
Right.
And all of the 3 will be part of the systems of the radar based of the U.S. anti-missile system.
Let me ask Ms. Lim about this. Ms. Lim, I don't want to drag you into the U.S. missile defense system debate, because it's not South Korea's job, and South Korea cannot make decisions about that. Having said that, though, it seems that your country are dealing with 2 issues at the same time. First of all, some turbulences in domestic politics in Seongji and elsewhere about the process, as you mentioned. Secondly, South Korea is being caught in between 2 big powers, the United States and China, in each other's mutual suspicion against one another. China certainly is afraid not about South Korea's reactions, but rather about what the U.S. is trying to do through South Korea toward China. So what do you make of these 2 dilemmas, it seems, that your country and your politics is facing now?
Again, many South Korean IR theories, international relation theories, we always thinking about our own survival strategies, especially between this kind of rivalry, not only just China, between the continental powers and the Pacific powers represented by the United States. Whenever these 2 powers collide or compete, I mean, it has been always a kind of challenge to us rather than an opportunity. So thus, this missile defense system, it is controversial because of that kind of concerns, as just Mr. Yang mentioned. But from our point of view, again, this THAAD, for example, it is only for just it should be supposed to be against the or for the deterrence vis-a-vis the North Korea's missile system, together with the nuclear program. Except that, I mean, there is no other reason for us, I mean, to deploy that kind of device, I mean, within our territory. And again, today it was the National Liberation Day, I mean, for us, and we have been proud of our own autonomous kind of strategy for our foreign policy. So, which means I hope, I mean, that this alliance relationship can be based on that kind of mutual understanding or more equal status between the United States and the Republic of Korea.
Interestingly said, Ms. Lim, because that allies relationship used to be the guarantee for South Korea to maintain peace and stability in the region. But will they continue to be so given the geopolitical changes in the region? That's an interesting question mark. Having said that, though, if we recall the days when President Park took first of all in the office back in the year 2013, she vowed to lay the groundwork for an era of harmonious unification through a trust-building process on the Korean Peninsula. She also came out with the so-called Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative to solve the Asian paradox. Now we are, Ms. Lim, only a few months before she disappears from the office, namely she's coming to the end of her term. How much have we seen her achieve some of her previous plans? And meanwhile, after all of this diplomacies with China, interactions with the United States, are things getting better for South Korea? In other words, how can we see her term dealing with the most thorny issue of the region and also for South Korea's own existence?
Yeah, in theory, you highlighted the trust politic and the NAPSI, the idea for the NAPSI, Northeast Asia Economic Cooperation Initiative. And together with the Eurasia Initiative, the three actually compose of the tripod of the Park Geun-hye administration's diplomacy. In theory, again, these three pillars are not supposed to entangle one in another, but in the reality, as long as, again, the North Korea doesn't stop provoking not only just us, I mean, to many others as well, with the nuclear and the missile tests. I mean, the other actually two, NAPSI and the Eurasia Initiative, also were almost like blocked or negatively influenced. That was the reality. So I feel very frustrated or sometimes disappointed about that too, because even though the international circumstance was like the toughest ever, but at the same time, I also wanted to see a more kind of strategic flexibility or like a strategic complexity of this specific administrations. But you're right, I mean, there's only like a one and almost like a half year left, and there are many uncertainties. For example, this year, our ally, the United States, they're going to have the presidential election, and it's going to be a huge, actually, a variable to our own foreign policy as well. So, but still, one thing I really have to highlight is I really want to see, I don't want to see a kind of disconnection of communication among us, especially between the China and Korea and the United States as well. So I think the G20, you previously reported about that. So I hope G20 can provide a good opportunity for that kind of discussion as well.
We hope that will be a great discussion format and platform, but it's only for communication. The question is whether strategically the countries believe so that they can work together. Mr. Yang, therefore, I want to come back to you about that. First of all, your brief comments about the intentions seem to be all agreed that South Korea is doing it for its own security's sake, but the result, will it necessarily match the intention and the expectation, is one big question mark. I want you to respond from this first, and then I'll have some other questions for you as well.
Let me put it by this way. On one hand, there are indeed threats, massive threats from North against the South. And for dealing with the stress, there are several options. And unfortunately, Park administration make the worst choice. For example,
from China's perspective.
Yeah, a few years ago, South Asian politicians and policymakers seriously discussed the issue of introducing Iron Dome system from Israel for protect South Korea from
another option.
Yeah. That's that option. And then I don't understand why they set aside this idea and then suddenly turn to the THAAD. And in my observation, Mr. Lim was correct. The ruling party had much more consultations and discussions with the United States than the consultations with the opposition parties
and other or local politicians.
So I really doubt that is the Americans' strong influences on the South Korean policy making that lead to a worst option.
Okay, that is your observation. But what about from the China side? South Korea has been saying, well, how much China, you can help us with the security guarantee. The U.S. does, at least with some options. So what can China do with us? That's the one question they ask. That's one question. And the other question is, what is likely for you, Mr. Yang, the future prospect of the Korean Peninsula issue? Because we see the six-party camp have been very much divided on this issue and by this issue alone. So can we see them still have the momentum and the institutional, in a way, willingness to work together at all? And what would that mean for the Korean Peninsula?
Well, for the first question, answer is very simple. Because the decision has been made about THAAD, so China has to do something unilateral by our own national interests. For second question, I think the games will last in the very complicated courses in the interactions between China, U.S., and China, South Korea. And the bad thing, the good thing is the top leaders will make use of the G20 as a good opportunity. But I don't think the bad thing is, I don't think the one-time summit between Park and Xi or Xi and Obama can solve this strategic, complicated issue.
All right. We do not know yet whether it will be confirmed the bilateral meetings among the three countries toward one another, but we hope that could be the case, and they will discuss some of the important issues, even come up with some options of solutions. But as we said, do not pin too much hope on one platform and one discussion only. For now, I would like to express my appreciation for both of you, Yu Zheng Lim in South Korea and Yang Xiyu here in China with us. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of a program, visit our website. Just type in World Insights CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us. Or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.